Okay, well, thanks so much for joining us for this first breakout session. I'm excited to introduce Robin McKinney, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Cash Campaign of Maryland, and she is going to be the one to tell you a little bit more about herself and her story, and talk about social justice and public policy careers as they relate to social work. Welcome, Robin.
Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is today. So I'm Robin McKinney. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Cash Campaign of Maryland. CASH stands for Creating Assets, Savings, and Hope. So I started the predecessor organization to the Cash Campaign, which was called Maryland Cash, about 10 years ago, and we recently merged two organizations together in the Cash Campaign in about the last 3 months. I'm a social worker from DSW on. I didn't know that was going to be my path. I started out as environmental science, actually, and got to college, and I was like, wow, those aren't my people. While I was passionate about environmental issues, like doing things with like dissecting pigs and, having to read 150 pages a night for my bio class, I was like, oh, maybe I'm going down the wrong path. So I actually ended up in social work in a different way. So at the Cash Campaign, we promote economic advancement for low to moderate income individuals and families in Baltimore City and also across the state. We serve 27,000 people a year, and a lot of that is through free tax preparation, and we bring back over $32 million to those folks. Most of the people that we serve make less than $54,000, and more than half of our clients make less than $20,000. So we're dealing with a very low income population. So that's what we're doing sort of at the micro level of this direct service, really all related to money. And then we do a lot to build the field. We know that if we want to have people to be able to serve to people in these different places, and of course I'm here to sell you that social work is the unique field to be able to help people both around their money and to be doing the public policy advocacy, we need to make sure that our practitioners are trained and supported. So right now we train about 50 or 500 rather to 1,000 folks a year. So we do a lot of trainings. We do a lot of work through University of Maryland School of Social Work, specifically on training social workers. And then the last thing we do is we advocate for policies. And the way I always frame our policy value is it going to help or hinder the financial security of the folks that we work with? And so if it's on either end of that, we're very interested. So my path is actually as a very unlikely advocate. I was very fiery as a person, a fiery activist at heart, starting at like age 3. And so I was like the first one to like boycott, to start the petition, to hold the sign up. My parents were civil rights activists, so as a person I was very fiery, but I never had an interest in public policy. I was always thought I would be the one on the outside of the State House with the sign, and never actually going in the doors and not talking to legislators. So what I found is that in my, so again I was both my undergraduate and my graduate degrees were really focused on community services and education. So I've worked in a homeless shelter, Planned Parenthood, a nursing home, sexual assault prevention and counseling center. I worked in a nonprofit community organizing sort of setting. And so none of those really had any contact with policy. And then all of my first jobs and all of my jobs have ended up in this financial services side of things, but again, were really never focused on policy. They were focused really on free tax preparation, financial education, financial coaching. And then all of a sudden, you start doing taxes with people and they're bringing their tax return from last year, and you look at the things that were happening on people's tax returns, dependents that were just totally made up, deductions that people shouldn't have taken, and you're dealing with these folks who have very little money and they were just getting ripped off. And we said, there's something we have to do, we have to stop these folks, and we looked and we realized that you actually had no regulation whatsoever to be a tax preparer. So here's this really critical financial document. In fact, the underpinning of our country, right, is like the government's ability to collect taxes to pay for the services, for the things that we want in our life. You actually had no educational background. There was no oversight. By the way, there isn't any in Minnesota, just FYI. And we needed to pass a law to do it. And it was one of those instances where we said, we should pass a law. This is crazy. This is a tax return. Our big line was, you actually have more regulation to cut someone's hair than to do their taxes. And so we said, yes, we should do something. And it was one of those moments where like, and then everyone stepped back and you realize, oh wait, I'm the only one standing left. And at the time, so I was new to Maryland. I moved to Maryland to go to grad school at University of Maryland. I'd never been to our state capital in Annapolis, even as a tourist. I'd never been there. I didn't know what legislative district I lived in. I didn't know what the legislative process was. And I didn't know a single legislator. That was 2007. We passed a bill to regulate state tax preparers in 2008. It was the first bill we put in, and it passed the first year that it had a hearing. So I went from 0 to a bill that protects 2 million Maryland residents in 1 year. And so when they say, can one person make a difference? And here is, and working with the tax preparation industry, I was a social worker, and you can better believe every single meeting I was in, I was with CPAs and enrolled agents and attorneys and all of these, people in the tax preparation field, and I was the only social worker. And the skills and the training that I learned as a social worker of how do you bring together diverse perspectives, how do you, use a lens of what's going to impact the community. Those are all the basic skills that I learned in my social work training that led us to be successful. So we mentioned the term social justice in the title for this, so I just wanted to give some examples of this. So justice can be around how wealth is distributed, how people have access to opportunities or not, and what privileges that people may have. So just some examples. The state and the federal budget is one opportunity where you can really clearly see what we as a society value or not, of where money flows. And so there's a really important role in advocacy of making sure that those who need the support, the services, the funding the most are able to get it. And so one of the things that we've been battling for a long time in our state now is this push around, providing tax cuts or tax benefits to those who make the most, which then are at the expense of those who can afford it the least. And in some cases, they actually use the populations that we work with as cover for that. So for example, a couple years ago, they made some changes to the estate tax, which helped higher wealth individuals who wanted to pass that wealth on to their children. So they raised what's called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a tax credit specifically for low-income working families. They raised that as a percentage, essentially to give them cover for saying, we're doing this thing that we know is going to help really higher wealth people, but we're then also going to lift up the lower income. And the only reason they did that, they could have just passed the estate tax, right? But it's because they had advocates like us, they had social workers, they had people working with community residents at the table that says, you cannot do something for the rich and not also help the poor. And so that is on us to be that sort of constant voice to make sure that we're bringing that justice, that sense of not equality, but of equity. So those folks who need it the most actually are getting it. That could also, the social justice could also look like helping people to get access to services and basic needs. There's a lot of advocacy work that goes around housing. For example, a big fight in Maryland right now and in a lot of places is around what they call source of income. So people that have a Section 8 vouchers, they are landlords that won't accept them. So people have a way, they have a tool, here we have this public benefit that people can use to be able to better afford housing, but landlords won't accept it. And advocacy is needed in order to do that. It's been a bill that's been in the Maryland General Assembly for 10 years. 10 years. Just to fight for people to be able to use what's a federal program to be able to get stable housing. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Same with access to opportunities. A lot of the conversations that we had in Maryland around the DREAM Act and at the federal level around DACA of making sure that folks have access to education, especially if they're an immigrant, whether they came when they were a child, whether they came later. And there's a lot of need to make sure that those voices and the values that we have about the aspirational aspect of why go to higher education, there's a lot of need for justice and for conversations in that. And same around protections against predatory practices. There's a lot of really terrible stuff, unfortunately, in our financial services marketplaces. People are paying a lot of money just to do basic things like get their check and figure out how to turn that into a way that they can pay their bills. Even though we have a lot of technology now, and we can do a lot on our phones or on the computer, for many of the folks that we work with, they're sort of locked out of those opportunities. So we talk about things like bank deserts, where people they have no access to banking whatsoever. So the only way that they can get access to their money is to cash their check at a liquor store or at a laundromat, which is charging anywhere from 1% to 10% of the value of that check. So how can we make sure that every community has access, again, to those opportunities and to those different services? So that's just sort of a brief definition of just some examples of what you could be working on in terms of public policy with social justice. In the field that I work in, which is called asset building, sometimes we call it financial capability. If you're here in our afternoon session, you'll realize that we have no consistency or do a terrible job of coming up with names that make any sense to anyone but ourselves. It's a real naming challenge in our field, because asset building kind of means nothing to anyone. This is how we see the universe, and what the idea behind this is that people have very different needs depending on where they are in their life cycle, of what programs they need, what products they need to be available to them, and what policies you need to support them. And this really, when I created this back in 2008, is just sort of a way to organize the system. What does that look like? So for us, the way we see sort of emergency and transitional services, those are folks who are in crisis. Those are people that need immediate needs. And so if I were working on policy and wanted to help people that were in crisis, I probably wouldn't be working on a retirement program, right? And trying to make sure that we get funding for people to get a refundable tax credit for their retirement savings, right? That's probably not going to be the space that I'm working in. But I would be working on things like making sure that you don't get penalized for saving money if you're on public benefits, which is something that we worked on in Maryland and a lot of states have. You aren't allowed to save typically more than $2,000 if you're receiving like temporary cash assistance or SNAP, which is food stamps. And so what that means is that people are trying to save enough money for first and last month's rent for an emergency, but as they're saving money, they actually lose their benefits. And so that's disincentivizing savings, right? So you might be working on policies like that. And so you can see most of the folks that we work in are in emergency and transitional services, financial stability, which are like folks who are paycheck to paycheck and are really one emergency away from being right back in a crisis. We do some work around short-term asset ownership. These are folks who are ready to make their money work a little bit more. They might be saving for something specific like a house, or they want to do something with a small business. In Baltimore, we refer to a lot of our business work as like, how do you support their side hustle? You know, they're not going to open a franchise of like a McDonald's or something. They're, a seamstress, or they make clothes, or they fix cars, and we're just trying to find a way to support that business and make sure that they're not, paying too much in taxes, or they're not, or that they're able to access some of the different resources that are available for small businesses that states can offer. So there are lots of, you can imagine for any topic, you got to come up with this framework to say, well, what are all of the options that could really support the folks that you care about? So we like to brag, and because so many of these battles are hard fought and won. And so we've been incredibly successful in passing policies over the last 10 years. And all of these policies and all of these things that we worked on, for a super majority of them, I think that I'm trying to see if there's any exceptions, there were 5 or less people working on them. And in a lot of cases, there were 1 or 2. And so again, that, while there could be often big coalitions that are needed to pass these things, so many of them are really about one person being able to pull together the right voices at the right time in order to get it done. And part of it too is because, when you're working in public policy, yes, there's plenty of face time with legislators and figuring out strategy and trying to move it forward, but so much of it is about education. It's educating people about the issue. It's educating, your peer organizations, the people sometimes within your own organization, people in communities, raising up to folks why this is such a problem and why whatever you're doing is the solution. And so when it comes to actually passing the bill, it's often a very small number of people that are actually the ones sort of in the rooms and in the hallways getting the deals done. Not always, there are some things that take a really long time. So just some examples of public policy careers. There are some that are much more on the analytical side. I will say one of the best things you can do working in a nonprofit, and especially working in public policy, is being a great writer. I cannot tell you how much I value that. When I see resumes and cover letters and writing samples, if the writing isn't strong, I know immediately it's not going to be a good fit. And there are times that you can mentor people to get better writers, but technical or this sort of business writing is such a critical skill. My minor in my undergrad was professional writing, and I think it was the best decision that I made, because I write grants, I write testimony, I write issue briefs, and so that analytical side in particular is really about taking complicated concepts and able to explain them and translate them for different audiences. That's what those analytical jobs are. Those are, I'd say, a great entry point. It's often less like legislator facing. A lot of them, these types of jobs are more office based, because you're sort of the backbone of the policy operation, is finding the data, crunching the numbers, writing the case. Sometimes these folks can also go out, but I would say typically they're more in the office. Bill tracking. This year we tracked, myself and an intern, tracked 160 bills that we had to know from one day to the next what the status was, what needed to be done. Not every single one of those bills was a priority, but that takes an ability to go in, figure out what's important for our organization, what's going to impact the people we care about, and how much time or effort do we need to put into all of those things. So that research and tracking is really important. Advocacy is really, can include a lot of things. It can include the communications, again, getting the word out about whatever the issue is. It can be direct lobbying, just developing the policy. And there's a lot of work that goes into developing the policy and what the best solution is. There's a great resource that a nonprofit in Baltimore came up with called Associated Black Charities, where they have 10 essential questions of how to use a race equity lens when you're designing any policy, so that you're baking that in right from the beginning and not sort of, one, having unintended consequences, certainly, but that right from the outset, as soon as you're even trying to figure out what the solution is, right from the beginning, you're taking a racial equity lens, and that's really important. It could be community organizing, again, finding groups of people who are impacted or could be impacted by a particular policy. Another path you could take is political. Being a legislative aide in the General Assembly is a great entry-level way to get a flavor of what policy looks like. I really encourage folks that think that they may want to get involved in elected office at some period of time, which hearing earlier that that there have been like this incredible amount of people since November who've decided that they want to run for office. Not sure what the push them over the edge to want to do that, but so it's really great to understand how the system works, and doing nonprofit advocacy is very different than working on the political side, because when you're working in a nonprofit, and as a social worker, I care deeply about the issues that impact the people that I care about. I don't care if that person is reelected or not. I don't care if that person is, like, how they're viewed by their constituents. I need to understand it, and I need to understand because that helps me to convince a legislator why an issue is important for them. But at the end of the day, it's not my job to make sure that that person gets reelected. And we have to be very, very careful in the nonprofit sector that we are nonpartisan and that we are not participating in campaign related activities. But it's really great learning, a really great learning place, especially early in your career, to work in an office and see what it's like on that side. I think you would be an even better advocate by understanding how that system works. Same with volunteering for a campaign or becoming a staff person on a campaign, understanding how that side of things worked. And that's something that I didn't do actually until after the election. Again, not sure what brought that on. Doing some work in another state really helped me to understand. I've been very careful. I often say we call ourselves like the white hat lobbyists, so I talk a lot about wanting to keep my white hat clean. But I felt like I needed to really understand what it looks like at the very local level. I think when we think about political campaigns, we often think about Congress. And we hear these sweeping conversations about campaign finance and things like that. But if you're talking about like a delegate, a senator at the local level, it's a very different game. And so understanding what that looks like is important. There are all kinds of different public policy organizations. So again, sort of one choice as you're thinking about where you might want to go is sort of the inside or the outside game, right? Do you want to work on issues or work in a community and do your advocacy from that perspective? Or do you want to work on the inside and work either with an elected official or through a government agency? Most government agencies have a policy person that focuses on that issue. So whether it's housing and community development, labor, the environment, every state agency and a lot of like local agencies all have a policy person that's interacting with the General Assembly and often also with the congressional delegation. So that is a sort of choice, and not that you can always bounce back and forth, and people do all the time, but that's something to think about because there are just different restrictions, right? If you're working for a state agency, you're working in a bureaucratic system, so your ability to make decisions on your own may be more limited because you have to get the approval of the secretary or whoever your higher ups are. In a nonprofit, you're also going to have people you report to, but you won't have the same laws or restrictions, but both have tremendous value. There are lots of think tanks or research groups on probably any topic you could possibly be interested in. When I first started doing policy work, I was like, there's an association for everything. And my favorite example is a group that I was sitting, you learn a lot waiting for your bill to come up, and so you're waiting for like 3 hours, sometimes waiting to testify for 3 minutes. And it was about tanning, and there's something called the Indoor Tanning Association. And I was like, indoor tanning, what do you mean? And then I was like, oh, a tanning salon. And it was like this whole debate that was unbelievable about issues I had never even thought of. And I was like, there's a group of people that care about tanning, and they formed an association. And just like, I never would have thought. So literally any topic you can imagine has an association. There are also groups like ours and others that have both direct services and advocacy. For us, that was something that was really important for us as part of the merger, was that we think that the best policies are sort of come from the experiences of people who are experiencing them. So there are lots of those. There are intermediaries or these membership association, unions and labor associations, though less than in previous times. There's still a lot of those. And there's also work, again, if you want to go the political path, working directly with political parties. So just to drill down on that point of even if you ended up in a career that you were more working in direct service, there is still such a vital role for working with individual people and connecting to that with policy. I really think that the best policies, again, like this free tax preparation or this tax preparer issue, I would have never known how terribly people were being screwed had I not been filling out hundreds and hundreds of tax returns every year and seeing what was happening. And that's really why we decided to pass that law. And because we were working with people, we knew how to structure it in a way so that those costs wouldn't just be passed on to the people that we were trying to serve. I also think that as a social worker and as a human, that we have an ethical responsibility to connect with practice and policy. I think a lot of times when people get in just a clinical track, they think, well, I don't want to go and lobby. And as you saw, there are so many different ways to get involved in policy besides direct lobbying that are critical, that are really critical to success. And I think that, and again, just raising up the voices of clients, both you doing it on their behalf, but in an ideal world, training and helping them to tell their own stories is such a underserved part of our political process. I wanted to share a couple of resources. Every job opportunity that we typically post at our organization is through Idealist and Indeed. That's where we post everything. Sometimes there are other places, like we post at the school social work certainly, and other places, but those are the two career sites that we always post on. There's also, I listed here, and these are all hot links so that when you get the PowerPoint you can go directly to them. There are lots of different networks. These are the examples in my field. Again, for every field that you can imagine, there are sets of networks. And so I gave some examples here. So the Annie Casey Foundation, which is actually my first employer, how I even got into this financial space, they do something called Kids Count, which is tracking indicators for children and families on lots of different topics. They have a set of grantees across the state. So for, I tried to find the Minnesota, who's doing it here for each of these networks. So if you're interested in children and families issues, the Kids Count would be great. The State Priorities Partnership is really around the budget, and again, that idea of what are we funding and how. Same with the EARN network. They're also looking at things related to the budget or sort of economic policy. Prosperity Now, full disclosure, I'm on their board. They have a set of community champions who are all working on these financial issues. And Prepare and Prosper is right in Minneapolis. And then the Minnesota Asset Building Coalition is a coalition dedicated, similar to us, working on financial security issues. But the list of their members could be very interesting to you to see, again, what are the wide sort of scope of people that even care about talking about financial security. So all good places to check out. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with is like, so why even do this? Why go public policy versus something else? Certainly you can help many more people. I think making the entire system more equitable is something that we all need to work on. The system is incredibly out of whack currently. It literally impacts every single thing that we do every day. Like the water we drink, the roads we drive on, the schools that we go to. And we have to make that transparent a lot of times because people just go through their life not even realizing what the government does on a regular basis. Making sure that like when you go to the store that milk is regulated. What does it mean to be pasteurized? Everything that we eat and drink. And there's a cost to that, and we need to be able to pay for the quality of life. But the last thing, I know it may sound funny, it feels really good to win. And a lot of people think when you do policy work, how do you get that connection? If you're working one-on-one with someone, you get to see that growth, and isn't that amazing? But that's why I showed that slide. Each of those wins felt so amazing because of how we know that it's going to make a difference in people's lives. So this year we had a big bill around payday lending. Quick show of hands, who knows anything? Have you ever heard the term payday lending? So it's a short-term loan that you can usually get to cover payday, and the interest rates are often like 400%. We've seen them as high as 1,000%. And so every couple years we have to come back and do something to try to stop them again in Maryland. And they came back, we found out that they were offering loans again in Maryland. They're all online. None of them are in a strip mall or in a storefront that you could go into. They're all online. And they were charging about 400% interest. We found out in December, we had no money, we had no time to build a campaign, and you're not gonna say like, oh, well, let's just let people get ripped off for another year because we're not organized, right? You're not gonna do that. You wanna stop it as soon as possible. So our organization, the Maryland Consumer Rights Coalition, came together. That's a party of two, and we each had like one staff person. I had an intern, she had a staff person, and had to figure it out. And we got $12,000. The industry spent $171,000 trying to defeat us. We had $12,000 that had like national group, we didn't even fund it, a national group came to help us. And why we were able to win that is because we engaged, we educated everyone who would listen, every nonprofit provider, every business, every legislator. We blasted out to everyone we could tell, this is ripping people off and it has to stop. And the legislators were receiving 50 to 100 calls every single day from people saying this will not stand. So we were 2 people in Annapolis every day with a shark head trying to raise issues and handing out shark gummy bears and trying to help people understand what a problem this was. But it was the power of those networks behind us, that education, that inspiring people to act, that enabled us to, with 2 people and $12,000, to go against 10 lobbyists and $171,000. And in the end, we won. We passed it unanimously in the House. They got 4 votes in the Senate that we wouldn't have had them anyway. And that is the power of the people, and that's the power of people like us. Again, it seems weird, it's like talking about finances, what does that have to do? But at the end of the day, this is something that was ripping off the communities that we care about. And to me, that's really inspiring and really jazzes me up that even though we called it Diana versus Goliath, not David versus Goliath, because it was 2 women, but that it can be done, and there's lots of opportunity here. So I'm going to stop on time. But if there are, I can take a couple of questions if anybody has any questions.
I think you blew them away, Robin.
No, I just talked really fast because I'm from the East Coast. So.
How do you decide which issues you want to pursue when launching for?
So for me, I found my lane with financial issues. Again, I've worked in like sexual assault and homelessness and things like that. And for me, when I started to see these different interventions or services around helping people with their finances, to me, I just found my lane because I felt like this is a thread that no matter, you could be working on mental health, you can be working in a hospital, you can be working with youth, you can be working with older adults, and money comes into people's lives, and money is really, for me, a root cause of so many of the issues related to poverty, that is what got me juiced up. And so part of it, though, is that I tried a lot of things. So I had all these internships, I had all these different experiences to say, all important, care about them, but it's something just sort of clicked when I found this. And part of it is probably, I grew up really low income. I had a brother who had disabilities, and we had a pretty chaotic life, and he passed away. And it resonated about the impact that finances have on people's lives. I could have gone down a path where I was a disability advocate. That could have happened for me too, It's just like you find the thing that clicks, but you don't know what's going to click until you try a lot of different things. And so whether it's volunteering in these different ways or through internships, I just really encourage you to try as many things as possible. And over the course of your career, you could be an education advocate, then you could be an advocate on something else. That's to me also what I love about social work is I feel like you're all smart people. You can learn content, right? Most of the people that come and work for me don't come with any understanding of the financial background, right? We train them up on the content, and they get fired up about economic justice. And so part of it is about getting the skill set and getting the comfort and understanding, and you can always learn content, and you can always learn new content.
So how did you end up in Maryland? Was that just where you were from, or?
No, I'm from the great state of Delaware. There's 5 people there. And I went to a small liberal arts school in Pennsylvania, and I knew I wanted to go to grad school because I was coming from my BSW, so you can do it in 1 year if you have your BSW. That was very appealing. I too was all about student loans, and my parents hadn't graduated from college, and so I knew that I needed to be in and out as fast as I could. And so one of my professors in my social work department had gone to Maryland for her PhD, and I had maybe been to Baltimore a handful of times, and I looked at a couple of schools, and when I went there, what I liked is that in my undergrad, I was the only one actually that didn't have a clinical focus, and I liked that the school had a focus on both clinical and macro. And yes, it's true that many social work schools have a lot of focus on micro and clinical work, but I really liked that the school was so dedicated to both, and that it was an urban campus, which means that, again, all these types of experiences that I wanted to have to figure out what pathway, they were all there because there's so much just going on in an urban area. Because I went to a very rural school for undergrad, so I wanted to sort of have both of those experiences. And I will say my internship when I was at the school was wild and opened my eyes up to a lot of, what heroin looks like. And, at one of my placements, I came in the one day and our workforce development person was passed out with a heroin needle in his arm. And there was a 16-year-old shot outside the front door of her office. And, some really deep and intense things happened during my placement that were, that people that we now work for and on behalf of see and deal with every single day. And so for me, it was really grounding to understand the context of people who grew up. Though I grew up poor, I also grew up white and privileged, and how is it different for people that didn't have that upbringing? And so it was really critical to my education.
Do you feel like it often happens where you kind of get educated in social work is where you end up working because of various internships or projects and needing to know the community?
I think it's a mix. I mean, for me, I fell in love with Baltimore. I grew up sort of outside of Philadelphia, and Baltimore and Philly are sort of related, which is that it's just really accessible. Like, in my opinion, Baltimore is like the greatest people on earth, right? I just love the people there so deeply. They're so real, they're so authentic, they're so community minded, and have been through so much and are so resilient that I fell in love with the place. I did happen to get married. I do have a toddler now, all of those things, but I've been now in my job for 10 years, which I never would have guessed. I'd never been at a job for more than 2 or 3 years before this. And part of it is, learning wherever you go to get to school. I'm sure that we have a lot of Maryland people that come through Maryland, but I feel like I could go and work anywhere. And also in the work that my first job out of grad school, I worked at a national foundation, and I was never in Baltimore. I was mostly in Milwaukee and Seattle. So, so it was immediately transferable to other places.
All right, well, can we say thank you to Robin?